All right, well, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here for the latest installment of our 2023 summer webinar series. This webinar is being recorded. Afterwards, the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to learn more about the Arkansas Native Plant Society, you can do so by visiting our website at anps.org. Joining the Native Plant Society is simple. Just go to our website. Hey, sorry, I'm dealing with a little bit of a summer cold. anps.org/join, where you can send a check to our treasurer. The address will be on there, or you can use your PayPal account to join online. Today, we'll be learning all about sedges, specifically the Carex genus, which is one of the largest genera of plants that I'm aware of anyway. Our speaker today is Karen Willard. Karen is a contract botanist who has worked for various state agencies, nonprofit organizations, and environmental consulting firms. She holds a master's degree in natural resources from the Ohio State University. Her main research interests include wetland ecology and the relationships and interactions between plants and insects. You may remember Karen from a previous webinar that she gave for the Native Plant Society on mosses of Arkansas, and we are excited to have her back again, sharing her knowledge this time on Arkansas sedges. Another upcoming webinar we have, the final one in our summer webinar series, will be a special 2-hour episode with Theo Witzel, who is the pretty popular, well-known botanist here in Arkansas, works for the Natural Heritage Commission, and they are finishing up their inventory of the plants of Benton and Washington counties. And so he's going to give us a 2-hour presentation on what they learned while doing that inventory. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Karen Willard. Karen, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Eric. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you coming and listening on this Saturday, and hopefully you can all hear me well. If not, let me know. And I'm just opening the ground, just to let you know now, if you have a question at any time, feel free to stop me, or you can unmute your mic or put it in the chats. I don't mind either way. I just want to start off by saying that this is the Carex of Arkansas title. So I will be showing a lot of pictures of different species that are common to Arkansas, but I really want to start off just by giving a little introduction in how to identify or spot a sedge versus other species that look very similar. And then if you're not really, wanting to go all in on identifying species, just some of the characteristics maybe that you want to photograph if you want someone else to ID it. Maybe if you use like an iNaturalist app or something like that. I know I use that all the time. So that will hopefully be helpful and interesting to everyone. Okay. I can get this slide. Oh, okay. Going to start off with the thank yous. So thanks, Eric and the Arkansas Native Plant Society for inviting me out today to give a talk. I appreciate that. And just something I've just been always interested in and love to share some of my knowledge with you guys. So thank you all for coming and listening today. And then I have some photo credits to give. So I got some permission from a couple of really great websites, and maybe these might be of interest to you if you're really into sedges. The Minnesota Wildflowers website. There are a lot of sedges that span not only Arkansas, but they have a large geographic range. So they're also in areas of the Northeast. And then maybe a site that's more specific to our region, the Southeastern Flora website. So both of these sites have a lot of great pictures, a lot of detailed images of sedges, especially in Carex. And if you're not familiar with the identification process with these guys, a lot of it is some very detailed information or characteristics that are really critical to identify the difference between some sedges just because they're so similar. I remember when I first started trying to learn these species, like I would flip through a bunch of picture books trying to find species, and I don't recommend it. There's a lot that look very too much alike. So Carex, I don't know if you guys are seeing this as well, this thing on top. But oh well. Anyway.
Sorry. Yeah, if things pop up, we might be having some people join a little late. I did send the wrong link out and leak some of the emails, so I'm sending the correct link out now. So we might have some late arrivals.
Okay, that's okay. All right. I see. Yeah, okay, because it's people popping up. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, it only is you're the only one that can see that. Everyone else doesn't show up for.
Oh, okay. Okay, good, good. Anyway, the Carex, the common name would be sedges, but this is just one genus in the big plant family Cyperaceae. But what makes it different from a lot of those other plants in that family are that male and female flowers are different. So usually a lot of flowers are what we call perfect, where you have the male parts, right? The pollen, and then the female parts, the ovaries, they're all on the same plant, or they're all on the same flower. In sedges, and as well as a lot of other grasses and other plants, we have separate male and female flowers. And very specifically to Carex, female flowers are in this little sac-like structure called the perigenium. So you can see that in the photograph to the right, Carex cherokeensis, or Cherokee sedge. You see this long structure with all these perigenia. So they're kind of a teardrop shape, very pointy at the tip, green. So those are the perigenia. And inside those perigenia are the female flowers. So that's sort of a structure that's unique to genus Carex. And as Eric mentioned, it's a very diverse group. In Arkansas alone, we have approximately-ish estimate 135 species or varieties that we've identified. But I feel like we're still not done figuring out what's all there yet. There's been like at least 3 species I know of that were described back in 2000, early 2000s. And I know that seems like a long time ago, but in the plant world, considering all that's been studied, that's fairly recent. These species are pretty much all perennials, so that makes them great for gardening, right? Because you don't have to worry about them just one year and they keep coming back. And I always sort of, when I first started, thought that these were only associated with wetlands, right? Like marshes or swamps, but they actually occur in a wide variety of habitats, dry woodlands or forests that are slightly moist soil. But the vast majority are a lot of wetland associated species. And aside from just their intrinsic value of being super awesome plants, they also are useful in like a process known as wetland delineation. So if you're not familiar, that's just identifying the boundaries of a wetland versus the upland, drier portion, right? Because a lot of wetlands are protected either through state or federal laws. And so being able to identify these wetland boundaries is important. And then depending on the season or time of year, also if it's a wet or a dry year, you can't really just tell based on whether there's water, right? And so sometimes we use things like plant community composition or the soil to identify them. And so sedges play a big role in helping us identify wetland boundaries. They're also important ecologically for nesting material, for birds or other mammals, food, shelter. There's a lot of skippers, which is a type of butterfly that use sedges as a host plant. And I have food here in bold just to remind me of a little story to tell you. So I was working up in West Virginia It's been almost 10 years now up in the Allegheny Mountains. Actually, shout out to the Dolly Sods Wilderness area in Tucker County, West Virginia. If you've never been there, I recommend it. It's a really cool place to explore. But anyway, I was working there and I met up once in a while with this botanist named Joan Gibson. She had studied wetlands up there. And one day she told me that her cat was one of the best botanists she ever knew. And I was like, okay, why is that? She's like, because my cat could very quickly and easily tell the difference between a sedge or a grass. And he only ate grass, apparently. And that kind of leads me to my next point, being that sedges are very similar to a couple other plants, mostly grasses. And I think one of the biggest things that I see is that people confuse sedges, grasses, and what I call true rushes. So these are 3 plant families. Collectively, sometimes they're referred to as graminoids or grass-like plants. And they're all very similar because they don't have showy petals. They don't have nice big flowers with showy petals. They're very highly modified and reduced. And they have really long leaves that have parallel veins. So they all look very similar. And they kind of overlap in habitat. And so you can't really tell them apart based on habitat. So I'm going to first start off by just giving you some of the key features that you can use, characteristics to tell these 3 big families apart. And I should mention there's always exceptions to the rules. So they're sort of like the bad boys of botany, if you will. They don't follow the rules. Well, but for the most part, there are some key features that you can use to easily tell these guys apart. But we'll first start with just some terms. So with all these graminoids, the leaf is not quite the same as other flowering plants. So you have 2 parts to the leaf. One is the blade, which is sort of that free hanging part that you think of as the leaf. They're very long, again, parallel veins running parallel to each other and to the margin of the leaf. And then just below that, you have what's called the sheath. So that's sort of the same leaf tissue that's wrapped around the stem. And sometimes with sedges and grasses, the stem also has a special name, so it's sometimes referred to as the culm. So if you see the word culm, that's just referring to the stem, so C-U-L-M, just referring to the stem, just a fancy name for the stem. Okay. Here I'm just trying to put too much stuff on one slide. So we'll just take it like one side at a time. So if you look at the left side of this slide, it's focusing on the grasses. So one of the easiest ways to tell a grass apart from a sedge is that grasses have round, hollow stems, and then interspersed throughout this stem are these hard, thickened areas called nodes. So you can see that here. So the nodes are probably the best way to tell a grass apart from a sedge. Sometimes when the grass is very immature, when it's just growing, all the sheaths are kind of covering up the nodes. So you might have to sort of dissect them or try to feel for the nodes with your hands. But that is sort of the best way. The other way that you can tell the grasses apart from sedges is that they have what's called an open sheath. So that's in the picture just below the nodes. And so it means that it's referring to the idea that the blade, when it turns into a sheath, is sort of wrapped around the stem, but those two sides of the sheath are not connected back together again. They're two kind of flaps on either side. Hopefully you can see that here. And that is, it's sort of like really mostly at the top, sort of right opposite where the blade occurs. And that's where you're going to see that the most. And there are some species that they sort of, the sheaths kind of overlap, so it's hard to tell. And again, you just kind of have to pick apart the sheaths to tell. That is very different from what the sheath of sedges look. So now if you look all the way to the right-hand side, I have pictures of the sheaths of a Carex sedge. So the sedge sheath is what's called a closed sheath. So if you look at the front of the sheath, that's sort of opposite the blade. It is kind of all the way wrapped around the stem, and there's no open flaps to see. And that front side, that side that's opposite the blade, is usually referred to as the ventral side. And it's usually very white, kind of translucent, or hyaline is a term that botanists use. So it's very different than the back side or the dorsal side of the sheath, the side that's connected to the blade. And all those appearance of the sides, different sides of the sheath, are kind of important for a lot of species, for species identification. So that's something that you may want to note. The stems are not hollow. They sort of have like a spongy tissue if you were to open them up. And then you also have that whole nursery rhyme, sedges have edges, rushes are round. Well, maybe not nursery, although we should fast track these kids into the botany program, right? So let's call it a nursery rhyme. Sedges have edges, rushes are round. So that's referring to the stem. So sedge stems are somewhat triangular in cross section. So if you were to cut that stem in half and look down on it, it normally, for many species, looks like a triangle with 3 sharp points. Those are the edges. Although, disclaimer, they're not all triangular, and the degree of the sharpness of those triangles is variable among species. Okay, so I personally don't like that saying because I have found in the past that it's not a very good characteristic for me. And if you look at all of the plants in the sedge family, there are many species that have round stems. So it's just something to note. And if you look at the box, the picture just above that sort of pale green box, it just shows what some of the sedge leaves look like. So some of the leaves are what we call pleated, where they look like they're folded in on each other, kind of like an old hand fan or accordion. And not all sedge leaves look like this, but if you see a leaf that's like that, then you can definitely rule out grasses or rushes. It's either probably a Carex or maybe a nut sedge, like a Scleria genus, but it's most likely in that Cyperaceae family and probably a Carex. So that might be helpful. And then if we look at rushes, or what I would call true rushes, because there's a lot of species in the sedge family, like bulrush or spike rush, so things that are called rushes, but they're not true rushes. So when I'm talking about true rushes, I would call only the plants in the Juncaceae family rushes. So they have either an open sheath or closed. One thing that's really useful is that their stems are always going to be round like grasses, but they don't have nodes. And the leaves are variable. They might be flat, like not folded. So they might be flat like grasses. They might be what's called channeled, which is just shown in this box below the pink box here. It's like they're sort of curved in on themselves, like a little water slide. Might be hard to tell from that picture. And some are round. So this picture all the way to the right is actually, it's not, it looks like a stem, but it's actually a leaf blade. So some of them are like round tubes. And sometimes they have little cross partitions in them, or what we refer to as septa or septate leaves. So if you were to run your finger and thumb along the leaf blade, it'd feel like little speed bumps going along. So those are some characteristics that help you identify the rushes. But I think the most useful way to tell sedges apart from rushes are when they're in flower or fruit. And then I also think it's important to note some of the differences between them, because sometimes when a true rush is in this fruit stage, it looks a lot like the perigynia of some sedges. Okay, so how do we tell those apart? So first off, the Juncaceae, the true rushes, their fruit is what's called a capsule. And we use the term dehiscent, and that just means that the capsule breaks apart, dehisces, breaking apart. And so you can see this in the picture in the top right corner. This capsule is sort of broken out, and then it releases all of these little brown seeds that are inside. So fruit is a capsule. The flowers are what we call perfect, because they have both male and female parts on one flower. So the picture on the bottom, very bottom right hand, shows you a picture of the juncus flower. So like the little pipe cleaner looking parts, those are the stigma, the female receptive surfaces that are going to accept the pollen. And then the sort of club-shaped structures just below that are the anthers. That's where the pollen is stored. So male and female parts on the same flower. And then just below that, those sharp looking pointy structures, those are the tepals. So you might be familiar with like the word sepals and petals, right? So the green parts just at the very bottom of a flower are the sepals, and then just above that are the petals. Sometimes when sepals and petals just kind of look exactly the same, they're referred to as tepals. And so that's what these structures are at the base of the flower or at below the capsule. Okay. And just like any good monocot, the monocotyledons, they have sepals and petals in three groups of threes. So there's usually 3 sepals, 3 petals, so usually 6 or more tepals. And then one other thing to note, sometimes the juncus flowers are sort of separate on the stem, very isolated, like you can see in that middle photograph to the right. And then sometimes you have flowers that are very densely clustered in these big round heads, sort of like what we call a globose inflorescence. And that's seen just below that pink box. Another thing to point out about this flower in particular of the juncus is that those capsules are sometimes very sharply pointed. They're just these yellow structures. So they're very immature capsules at that stage. Sometimes they're round, sometimes they're pointed. Okay, so those are the juncus flowers and inflorescence. Now, if we look at the sort of partition to the right side, or sorry, to the left now, see the first sedge photograph. It's labeled Minnesota wildflowers. So there you see that male flowers, they're here up at the top. There's a lot of anthers sticking out. These are these yellow structures. And then in this particular plant, female flowers are on separate spikes at the bottom. So male and female flowers are separate in sedges. In rushes, they're all on the same, the male and female parts are on the same flower. Looking at the photograph to the far left, there is a photograph of the perigynia. So this is sort of that sac that surrounds the female flower. And for every female flower and perigynia, just directly underneath that, you'll have a scale. I can see a lot of people, and I know I was one of those people a long time ago, that could probably easily confuse this structure, which looks like a capsule, with this structure, which actually is a capsule, right? They're both sort of round, globose looking things. The key to remembering the difference is that juncus will have 6 or more little tepals. Sedges are just going to have the one scale underneath. So if you remember that, you should be good. When you see those two structures, you should be able to hopefully recognize the difference between the two. And then finally, for this last part of this slide, the fruits of all, both Carex and all the others that are in that Cyperaceae family, they're going to be what are called achenes. So here are some images of achenes. They come in various sizes and shapes and colors. But what makes them different from capsules is that they're not going to break apart. They're what's called indehiscent, not breaking apart. And Carex achenes kind of come in 2 different shapes. I'm not sure if it's clear on this photograph. I hope it is. They're kind of small. But the top 3 of those achenes have 3 sides. So they're sort of like a tetrahedron. So 3-sided surface. And that's because they had, when they were a flower, they had 3 stigmatic surfaces, and they developed into a 3-sided achene. And I point this out because if you are going to do that deep dive into identifying sedges and using a dichotomous key, one of the main first things that it asks you are, for a lot of keys anyway, does the flower have 3 stigmatic surfaces or 2? And usually by the time you're ready to identify a sedge, because it's easier to identify it in a mature fruit stage, those stigmas have fallen off. So the other way to tell is the shape of the fruit. So if it's triangular in shape, 3 surfaces that had 3 stigmas, and then this very tiny little one at the bottom, it's just got 2 surfaces. It's sort of flat shaped. That would have been produced from a flower that only had 2 stigmatic surfaces or 2 stigmas. So they kind of branch out into a little pair of stigmas. If anyone has any questions at all, I feel like that may be more interesting than me rattling on, but if you want, I will proceed.
We do have one question in the chat. Ingrid asks,
okay.
do you have any recommendations for dichotomous keys for Carex in Arkansas?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So what I usually use is the Flora of North America. So that can be accessed online, efloras.org. It is not specific to just Arkansas, right? So it's going to be all of it's pretty much North America, north of Mexico. But that's my go-to. The Flora of Arkansas is a key you can use, but it doesn't have all the species. It's a little it's older, so it doesn't have at that time what we knew of all the species that occurred in Arkansas. And so that's why I like the Flora of North America, because although it's a lot more daunting because you're dealing with a lot more species, but it's better than not having all of them that are actually in Arkansas, because then it's frustrating to try to key out a species that is not in your key, right? So otherwise, I don't know of any up-to-date keys of Arkansas. And so that's why I use the more general Flora of North America. So that's a good question. So the next...
Sorry, Ingrid had one more question.
Yeah.
Do you have a preferred information source for species distribution?
No, well, no. So the only thing I have is the atlas, the atlas of Arkansas, and that's not the correct full name. That the atlas that was produced by Theo Witzel, Jennifer Ogle, and Johnny Gentry, which is a little out of date at this point, but it's fairly good as far as the information. But yeah, there isn't any. You know, what we need is more of a website that can be updated, right? Because anything that's printed is going to be out of date within a couple years, I feel like, as far as like distribution, right? Because there's always going to be more and more species. Like 2000s, there were 3 new species that were described in Arkansas, or described for North America, right? And so there's probably more. So, you know, it's hard, it's a battle, but that's what I use and recommend as far as distribution.
Jim Sullivan recommends checking out Jerry Jenkins' key on Amazon and says it has amazing photographs. Sarah
Nice.
Gertz says the name that you're trying to think of is the Atlas, the Vascular Plants of Arkansas. Ingrid is also asking this to Jerry, but I guess we can pose this question to you too. Any thoughts on bonab.org, Biota of North America?
Yeah, that unfortunately, I mean, that's a good resource. I also feel like maybe hasn't been updated in a while.
I think the last I saw was 2014.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, which is good. Yeah, I mean, that definitely a great resource. For sure.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions for now. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering what the recommendation for like a key, where was that? Was it for all of, was it specific for Arkansas or?
I'm looking it up on Amazon now. You might be able to comment, but it sounds like there was something on Amazon, a key by Jerry Jenkins.
Jerry Jenkins, okay.
see.
There's also like the flora of the southeast, the Weeklies flora. That's more of a southeastern, and I feel like a lot of the key is similar to what's in the flora of North America. I just like that because it's like really authored by the experts in this field. I think you could say, like Tony Reznicek, people who really study them. Not to say that the others aren't, but I think that's sort of a really useful one.
Now, I know Mullen-Brock has published a lot on the sedges of was it Illinois, and some of those may have keys in them.
Yes, I think I have sedge keys for Ohio, for Illinois, and I think there's a lot of overlap for sure. And that gives you a lot of probably the most common species for sure. Yeah.
I know Theo Witzel had mentioned Mullen-Brock being it's about as close as you can get to Arkansas for being useful for sedges here.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree. That's a good one. And he's like an expert for sure.
And then I think there's Philip Hyatt, which I think he might be in Missouri, but he does a lot with sedges in Arkansas. I think he may have some, I can't remember if it's keys, but it's at least some publications out there. Sedgehead.com, I believe, is his website.
Nice. Yeah. I don't know if he made any keys for Arkansas, but I know that maybe he had a checklist of the Carex in Arkansas, and it might be a little older as well, but useful for sure, like for the most of them. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, I'll like keep the questions coming. I love that. Yeah. Hopefully I'm not boring you. Maybe you already know this stuff. Anyway.
Sorry, one more resource. This is something that
yeah.
Diana Soteropoulos had recommended for sedges, but Dr. Anton Reznicek, I believe he's also authoritative figure on the graminoids and sedges. But he has some YouTube videos out there as well that you can watch.
Nice. Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. Anthony or Tony Reznicek is sort of I think Michigan is where he's based out of. And yeah, he's probably one of the spearheads of the Flora of North America sedge section. And I would say, is probably who I think of as sort of the expert in sedges. So anyway, so a little bit more on the terms. So all those male and female flowers are clustered together in what we would call spikes. Sometimes they're referred to as spikelets. They come in different forms. So like if we start on the left-hand side, sometimes you have spikes that are basically all female or all male. And the females you'll recognize because they're usually some various shade of brown or green. They're usually swollen, especially when they're mature, in their mature fruiting stage. So they're going to be a lot fatter. And then the male spikes are going to be sort of a shell of their former self. So all their pollen anthers are no longer, when it's mature, no longer sticking out. They're just basically like a very thin stalk with scales. And sometimes those male scales are important in identification, but they're really just, they're just sort of hanging out now. They've done their bit. And then sometimes you have some variation of a bract. So this is a either leaf-like structure, or in the middle photograph, more like just a thin little wisp of a bract. Usually they're more leaf-like, but they're considered different than leaves. They're just directly underneath those spikes. And so those bracts, I just point them out because, again, for some species, looking at the shape or width sometimes can be important in species ID. And so this one, male, female spikes, leaf-like bracts. This is Carex granularis or limestone meadow sedge. It's a really common species that you find in open, moist areas. I see it a lot in roadside ditches, wet meadows, and it's fairly distinct in that it's just lots and lots of Periginia, very round, but there's no sort of like beak to it. And I'll talk about that, what a beak is, in another slide. So then sometimes you might also have another variation where you have both male and females flowers on the same spike. So when the female flowers are sitting just below the male flowers, these are what we call a gynandrous spike. And when I see spikes that look like this, or if I don't see male flowers at all, then I assume it's that sort of arrangement where the male flowers on top, because when those female flowers mature, they sometimes sort of push the male flowers and they just break off. So if you don't really see any male flowers at all, it's probably this type of arrangement where the male flowers were at the top and the females were at the bottom. They just sort of broke off. And then the final variation is where the female flowers are up above. They're both on the same stalk, but the female flowers are on top and then the male flowers are below. And I think it was Eric who had mentioned that this, or maybe he had said Theo had talked about it. You could imagine this as an ice cream cone, right? Where there's very heavy, top heavy at the top, big female flowers at the top, and then a very narrow, almost cone shape as it goes down to the male flowers.
Yeah, that was Theo, and he had told me when in relation to Carex bushii, because the top part looks more like a scoop, and then the cone at the bottom. Yes.
So maybe not this one as much, but anywho, when I think of this particular sedge is one of my favorites. It's like Carex shortiana, the short sedge. And there's not a lot of sedges that have sort of the female on top and the male spikes on or flowers on the bottom. I feel like that's sort of not as common as the others. But it has a deep, rich brown Periginia when they're mature. It just reminds me of a big stack of Oreo cookies. So I like it. It's a beautiful sedge. I wish I had that one planted in my yard for sure. It's nice. Okay. So some other terms that might be useful, maybe you're not familiar when we're talking about sedges. Looking first at the right-hand side. Sedges, Periginia, have wings and beaks. They're not birds, but they've got them. So sometimes, right? So when we're referring to the beak of a Periginia, it's sort of in cases where the Periginia has a broad, what would be the body of the Periginia, and then it very abruptly narrows into a very thin structure portion at the top, and that we refer to as the beak. So there's the beak at the top, and then the rest of the portion that's much broader would be the body of the sedge. Sorry, the Periginia. And then in some cases, especially in some of these very thin Periginia with flat achenes, you'll have what's called a wing. So hopefully you can kind of see that it's slightly different in color to the rest of the body. So it's just a very thin flap that surrounds a portion or all of the body of the Periginia. So the thickness, the width of the wing, where it occurs, either top or the bottom of the Periginia, can be an important aspect as well. So there's just another part. And then if we look, so that's Carex alata in this one, which is a rare sedge, actually in Arkansas. distinct in that, well, besides the size, a lot of the sedges in that group are very, you need to measure the perigynia, but very broad at the top, at the base. It's got these broad shoulders, and then it narrows down as you go to the bottom. The sedge to the left-hand side is another one that's fairly rare. It really demonstrates some important aspects. So this is Carex camosa, and at the very top of this beak, if you see that it splits into two parts, we refer to that as having teeth. Usually it's not really that, they're not really that long, and they're usually not bent outward. They're usually kind of straight. But in this case, it's very extreme, very long teeth, very outwardly bent. And so that's sort of a defining character of Carex camosa for this region. I don't think there's any others that are quite like that. So long teeth. And then just next to these perigynia is the scale that will always be the one scale underneath just sitting underneath the perigynia. If you look at the bottom, it's sort of got what we would say the body of the scale. It's kind of white. And then in the middle, we would refer to that as like the midrib. And in this case, it extends way beyond the body of the scale. And so when that happens, that part of the scale is what we call the awn. And this is another extreme example. They're usually sometimes very, very short. So if I haven't mentioned it yet, I mean, you may notice like this little scale bar is in millimeters. So these are very tiny structures. This scale alone is like the width of a millimeter. So identifying a sedges usually requires some sort of a hand lens. If you have access to a dissecting microscope, that's awesome. But you can also just pick up a hand lens and not spend a lot of money. And you can see some of these characters. So things to know. Like if you are out in the field and you're wanting to identify a species, or you're wanting someone else that you know, your favorite sedge identifying friend to help you out, there's some characteristics that will be important or helpful to identify or to photograph or to note in a notebook. So one is what's called the habit. So this is different than habitat, which is where it lives, right? So habit is just like the general overall appearance of the plant as a whole. And so you can kind of classify them in two broad categories, whether they are very clumped, where you have lots and lots of stems that are all clumped together, and that's shown in the left-hand side photograph. And we refer to that as cespitose, very clumped. And the other category, looking all the way to the right-hand side, if they're really spaced apart, you see a lot of daylight between the stems, then they have very long rhizomes. So the rhizomes are just underground structures. So that's what I'm showing here in the middle part. If you haven't ever dug up a sedge before, that's sort of what they look like. So the rhizomes are going to be sort of like horizontal, like parallel to the ground as they grow. They're connecting the different stems together, and they're usually kind of have these like brown scales and then roots shooting off down to the ground. So those are what the rhizomes look like. Some other features that you can get from the habit are the stems facing upright? Are they erect, or are they flop down onto the ground? And that a lot of time you have sedges where the stems just sort of are weaker and they don't stay in upright. You can also get information on, do you have a bunch of stalks with flowering inflorescences, or are they mostly just leafy stalks, so vegetative growth? So there's a lot of information that you can get from just a very basic habitat picture. I know it doesn't look like it from afar. It looks like not a lot of detail, but you can get a lot of information that can be helpful in the identification of a sedge species just by having that extra habitat photograph. Other super important characteristics, starting off again on that left-hand side, the sheath at the very base, just below or just before you get to the ground. And this is really important for sedges that you find in woodlands, I find. So my rule of thumb is if I'm in the woods and I want to identify a sedge and I'm not collecting it, I take a picture of the base. So I find a lot of species, if you look at the keys, is the base of the stem red, like it's shown here? Is it brown? Is it just white? That can be super helpful to just identifying a species, especially in woodlands. So that might be something to think about that you might not have considered before. Middle photograph, I think I mentioned as well already, but the sheath, both the front and the back of the sheath, and it just depends on the species whether or not that's an important characteristic or not. Like in this photograph, you see how there's sort of the front of the sheath, that whiter part kind of has all these like little thick lines, or it looks wrinkly. Sometimes the sheath is very smooth, so you don't see all those lines and wrinkles in it. Sometimes the back of the sheath has little dots on it. Sometimes it's all one continuous color. Sometimes it's like striped, like this one sort of looks like white and green stripe. All those little features, some people, that's what makes sedges fun and interesting, is there's all these little features, picky details. Some people drives crazy. I've kind of been in between. I don't know. It's fun. And then the most important part, something I did not know until later on in my identifying sedges. When I first started, I didn't realize having a mature fruit is really important in a lot of sedge identification. Like that's what the keys are usually based on, is a sedge when the fruit is mature. And that's what a lot of the measurements. So there's some sedges where it's like 0.5 millimeter is the difference between one species or another. And so having a mature sedge sometimes can be, at least as far as I understand it, and I am not an expert, I'm just working through keys. And that's what I have found. So the perigynia, also the scales, what they look like just underneath the perigynia, whether they have awns or not, their color, perigynia shape, perigynia color, texture, size, all those characteristics. That is probably the most important. So like for me, when I see a sedge in flower, when I see the anthers and stigmas out, I'm just like, I'll see you later. I don't really kind of mess with them until they're mature, unless I know, like over time you become familiar with some of the more common species and you can identify it just based on immature fruits, or immature flowers. But for the most part, it's easier at the beginning to wait until they're mature. And for the most part, late May is a good time for most. There's some that are a little earlier. Those are actually a lot of woodlands. And I have some slides of some of those species, or one of those species. And some are a little later. But late May is usually a good time. All right. So the rest of the talk is really just going through some of the more common species of Arkansas. So if you have any questions, just let me know at any time. Okay, so you have these sedges. these two sedges, does anyone think they look the same? So there's a sedge on the top, its flowering stalk and its habit, and then the sedge on the bottom. We should take a vote. Are they the same? They look the same to me.
They look very, very similar.
They look very similar. They might look a little different, right? So the sedge on the top, so both sedges, inflorescences where the female flowers are on the bottom, the male's on the top, very clustered, only about like 5 spikes, but they're all very, very tightly clustered at the top. So those are distinct characters. The sedge on the top, photographed in a roadside ditch, full sun, open, moist soil. The one on the bottom, photographed, you can see much less dense, photographed in a woodland habitat. But in general, if I was just looking at these two plants, I would say they look very similar. Let's look at so my main point, now the one that was on the bottom before is on the top. I don't know how that happened. Bad planning. Anyway, the woodland sedge that was on the bottom before, now on the top, is Carex cephaliflora, or oval-headed sedge. The one on the bottom that was more in an open roadside ditch, that's Carex leavenworthii, or Leavenworth sedge. And hopefully you can tell it's all about, in this case, the shape of the paragenia. And that is probably true for a large portion of species, or at least one very important characteristic. Carex cephaliflora, if you look at it, give me my pointer out here, broadest sort of in the middle of the body of that sedge, right? So what we would call maybe elliptical in shape. Carex leavenworthii, much broader at the base. So what we would say is ovate shape, very broad at the base. And so just having, I guess the main point is just having like the picture of the inflorescence sometimes not be enough. Sometimes you really do need to pick apart those actual paragenia and look at the shape of them. And then you can really see, and sometimes the scales as well can be critical in identifying the difference between species. Because to me, those two look like pretty much exactly the same. Otherwise. Here is a very common species that you may have seen before. This is Frank's sedge, or Carex frankii. It is a cespitose sedge, so very densely clumped, lots of stems. You really only find it in full sun habitats, but you'll find it in a lot of habitats. It's really common. It really likes moist soil, but I also have it like on the edge of my lawn in sort of a mesic soil habitat. Edges of ponds, wet meadows. It's very common as long as there's the full sun. And I feel like it's very distinct. So one thing that you might know is that the male and the female flowers are on separate stalks. So this brown stalk at the top on that left-hand picture is the male spike with all male flowers. The females are at the bottom, multiple female spikes. They're kind of sitting low in the plant, right? So like there's lots of leaves that are much taller. It's almost kind of hidden. And that's sort of a unique, not unique aspect, but a very useful characteristic for identifying it. If you look more closely at the female spike, you can see that it's really densely packed. Like there's not a lot of room for any space, which is not true for all sedge spikes. So that is fairly distinct. And of course, you've got this very long beak. And then if you look even more closely at the spikes just below the actual female spike, that scale is just sort of like that picture to the right. It's just sort of like a whisker. There's no like actual tissue to the scale. It's just sort of a thin little wisp. And then the perigynia, really flat on the top, the surface that's kind of exposed to your view. And then very sharply triangular, narrowed. And then of course a very large beak. So I don't know how much time we have left, or how like long. Am I going over?
You're totally fine. I mean, people can stick around as long as they want, but honestly, the recording is going to go on YouTube, so go as long as you would like.
Okay, well, I'll just explain the plants that I have, and yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them or stop me at any time. And yeah, if you also need to jet, that's fine too. There's really nothing else that it can be confused with besides, as far as I know, as what I can think of, besides Carex areolensis, golden cattail sedge. And to me, it looks exactly the same. But there are some characteristics that you can use to tell them apart. One is looking all the way to the right side, just the habit, right? So now this is that habit. This is a long rhizome. The stems are very highly spaced apart, so there's a lot of air or distance between the stems. So long rhizomes spaced apart. You generally only find this in more shaded habitat, as opposed to Frankii, which loves the sun. And I don't know if it's very clear on this image, but in the middle, I have my arrow kind of pointing right to it. The scale is not just a whisker, but there is a little bit of tissue on the base of that scale. And I know that seems like super nitpicky, tiny, hard to tell, but that's the way kind of sedges be, like that. I don't know if it's clear in that. I hope it's clear in that picture, but that's like one of the best ways to tell them apart, is that the scale, the base of the perigynia, is, you can actually see some tissue at the base, white, thin little strip of tissue, whereas Carex frankii, it's just sort of a thin little whisker. There's just a cat's whisker. Okay. Here's another sedge that I think is super common. It's the fox sedge, Carex vulpinoidea. And I see that sometimes confused a lot with a couple others. You can look at the right-hand side photograph, lots of little spikelets, all those spikelets with the female on the bottom, male on top. The male spikelets sort of disappear. You can't really see that they're there. And there's a lot of species that are like this, with lots of spikes in a dense, long cluster. But Carex vulpinoidea is usually distinct from the others in that the flowering stalk is much lower in most cases than the leaves. So the leaves are going to be much longer. They're going to overtop the length of that inflorescence. And so that's what's usually used as like the main characteristic to tell that apart from a lot of others that look very similar. And I have some images to show you of similar species. Okay, so starting at the left-hand side in that photograph with like a purple background, the one all the way to the left, that's Carex vulpinoidea. The one right next to it, and it might be very obvious when they're like side by side. Sometimes when they're not, it can be a little trickier because they're like a spike with lots and lots of flowers. But the one next to it, that's Carex triangularis. And the one just to the right of that and a little bit further down, with the Minnesota wildflowers label. That's yellow fruited sedge, or Carex annectans. So when I look at these, again, super similar. I would be hard pressed to tell them apart sometimes. One characteristics that's different from Carex vulpinoidea to the other two, as I kind of mentioned before, and we can see here in this photograph that's sort of in the middle, the habit shot. This is Carex triangularis, and you can see that the flowering stalks, well, it might be hard to tell, but trust me, the flowering stalks are much taller than the leaves. It's hard to tell because there's lots of leaves in the background. But the flowering stalks are much longer between Carex vulpinoidea versus the other two. So that is a picture of Carex triangularis. And then the other way, again, we're just looking at the Perigenia. We're just repeating all that. If we look at the top in this picture with the blue background, just above the habit shot, the two Perigenia pictures all the way to the right, those are Carex vulpinoidea. And what I noticed compared to the picture on the left, these Perigenia, which are Carex annectans, the yellow fruited sedge. So Carex vulpinoidea, long beak, almost as long as the body. Narrow body, just like a little over a millimeter wide. Carex annectans, like compared to the body of the Perigenia, super short. And then that body is a lot wider. And then so then the picture to the right of that is another picture of Perigenia of Carex annectans. So just compare that to Carex triangularis, which is in the bottom left-hand photograph. So those Perigenia, much wider, and what you can't really see very well in this photograph, and here's where your hand lens is going to come in to play again, probably, is that Carex triangularis has little tiny red dots on the Perigenia. Lots of little red dots, and it's easiest to see, again, when it's very mature. Sometimes when the Perigenia is not, when it's still green, I have a hard time seeing this. But when it's sort of in that tan state, on the front surface, or the surface opposite the scale, which is called the adaxial surface of the Perigenia, the surface opposite the side of where the scale would be, that's where you're going to see all these little red dots if you have a hand lens. But you can really tell just from the shape, much broader than either, in general, usually than Carex annectans or vulpinoidea. But sometimes it's all relative. So like either a good measurement or picture can be really helpful just to help compare the different species. Are there any questions or in the chats? I feel like there's other things, but maybe. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, no.
And feel free to mute your mics, or I'm sorry, unmute your mics if you have a question also. If you don't want to enter it into the chat, either one is fine.
Yeah, no, I just saw some extra things, but it was just saying goodbye, I think. So that's why I was looking. Sorry. I know you're on top of that, Eric. Thank you for that.
No, you're good. I'll read you all the compliments at the very end.
Yeah, that's fine. Another really common species is Carex lurida. And I'm not sure what the common name is, because I've seen shallow sedge and I've seen sallow sedge without the H. And so I'm not sure if they're just misspelling it, or if the name, I don't know what the name is. I don't know what the common name is. Anyway, Carex lurida is a very common species, and it's fairly distinct as well. It's bottle brush shape looking spikes, right? It's very long beaks, very pointed. And then the Periginia, I kind of haven't really mentioned or touched upon this. It's very, what would you say, maybe inflated, right? So there's a lot of space between the achene inside, the fruit inside, and the actual Periginia itself. And so that can be also a helpful character. And maybe that's also sort of helping it float to transmit its seeds off along the stream. It's another very densely clustered sedge, as you can see in the photograph. And it's usually in more open habitats, but I've seen it in forests as well, or next to streams in the woods. Just needs to be near some really like moist, wet, either like saturated soil or next to a stream. So usually it needs to be in some very wet conditions. The only species I think maybe could be confused with would be this Carex, and I'm not going to pronounce it right, Harastricina. And that species, it looks pretty much the same, but if you look at the very tip of the beak, it's going to have some short little teeth. So it'll be split at the top of the beak. And then if you look at this picture on the Periginia here, it's basically just like cut off, it's flat. There's no teeth there. And so that's like the best way to tell those guys apart, which are the very overall superficially look pretty much the same to me. But the shape of the Periginia is also subtly different. But the teeth, just seeing the teeth is sort of a way to kind of tell them apart for sure, I guess you could say. Now some more woodland only sedges, just to finish up. Carex albicans. This is one of those species that's like an early fruiting or early flowering and then early fruiting species. So like in Northwest Arkansas, and it might the flowering phenology might be different in other parts of Arkansas, but where I am in Northwest Arkansas, it's going to be fruiting by early May to mid-May, and then done by late May, and all the fruits are gone. You'll find this species is really common in mesic forests. I see it a lot like on rock outcrops, rocky woodland slopes. And it's sort of unique in that the stems are flopped onto the ground. Usually they're very long and it's just sort of prostrate. They're just falling on the ground. The leaves are really narrow. They're only like a couple millimeters wide. The flowering stalks are usually just longer than the leaves themselves, which differentiates it from other very similar looking species. And this is in a group. So because there's so many sedges, they can be classified into like subgenera or groups. And this is in the group Acrocystis. And those species all tend to have these kind of cool scales. You can see there's a lot of like dark reddish purple on the scales. The Periginia are kind of fuzzy, so they're hairy looking. But the narrow leaves, the long stalks of inflorescence kind of help you differentiate Carex albicans from others in that group. There's actually 3 different varieties of albicans, but I won't go into that stuff. But that's another cool sedge to find only. I've never seen it anywhere else, but in the in the woods. Never really in open habitats for that species. Another woodland species that's really common in Arkansas is Carex oligocarpa. The few fruited, I'm having trouble talking now, the few fruited sedge. And it's called that because there's really, on the female spikes, which are separate from the males, there's usually only like up to 8 at the most perigynia or flowers, and usually maybe even less, 3 to 8 at the most. It's in one of these groups of sedges that their perigynia have, if you look at the left-hand side, lots of veins running along the perigynia. So it's sort of distinct in that way. You don't see that in all the perigynia of all the sedges. So that's one way to kind of separate it from a lot of other species. It has really long awns on these scales. So the awns are very long, almost like well beyond the size of the fruits, or the perigynia, I should say. And one feature that some of the woodland sedges have is either it's two ranked or it's more spirally. The flowers are either two ranked or spirally arranged along the stalk. So what I mean by that, if it's two ranked, it's like the perigynia are opposite one another, and they sort of create sort of a flat appearance on a same sort of similar plane. And I don't know if you can tell, but that's sort of what we have going on in this middle photograph on this particular flower or flowering stalk spike. So they're either on one, they're coming off at one angle or directly opposite angle. They're not all willy-nilly arranged along in all multitudes of directions. So it gives it sort of a flat appearance to the spike. And if you look just below the spike at the sheath, like the very apex of the sheath, it's got this like convex, very protruding little piece of tissue, which is fairly characteristic. And then finally, like I mentioned, some of the woodland sedges, the color, the base of the stem, it's not very obvious here, but it's sort of a more reddish, purplish tinged color. The other alternative would be more brown or white. So looking at that is usually another, it's usually looking at multiple characteristics just as a check to make sure you know that, because there's so many that are so similar, that can be a great way to tell them apart. In here, I just wanted to put this Eastern narrowleaf sedge in there, Carex amphibula, because I wanted to show maybe a more spirally arranged inflorescence, one that is less flat looking. And hopefully I'm explaining it and you can kind of tell the difference. But it's less, each flower, excuse me, getting a little dry here. Flowers aren't like right directly across from each other. They're sort of projecting from multiple angles. And so that's what I mean by spirally arranged versus that two ranked, where it's either on one side or the other all the way down the stalk of the inflorescence. So Carex amphibula is one that has a more spirally arranged inflorescence, and it also has a fairly unique beak shape. But I do want to point out it's very closely related to Carex oligocarpa, and similar in that it has those lots of veins on the perigynia. Maybe if you can see that, they're kind of very faint, but it looks almost like the perigynia is almost textured because there's all these veins on it. But the shape is very different. And I wouldn't say it has a beak necessarily, because like with a beak, you can kind of have like a definite pointy part and a definite round part that's the body. And I don't really see that on these, but I do see like it's gradually, very slowly tapering up to a point. And so that's kind of, there's only a couple sedges that sort of have that similar look to them. So it's sort of unique, helpful shape for that species. And that's another woodland, mostly woodland, sometimes partial shade, open areas species. Here's a cool sedge that I really like, and it's only really I've only seen it in very mesic forests or hollows, that maybe north-facing slopes that are very cool, moist soil, not a lot of exposure to the sunlight. Really broad, beautiful leaves, so like up to 44 millimeters. Yeah, that's the thing with a lot of the keys, is that you have to get used to the metric system if you're not. So it's probably about 1.25 inches wide at the most. And it also has these very broad leaf-like bracts that are just adjacent to the inflorescence. They're very similar to Carex blanda in that they're like a very pale green, especially when they first start out. But those broad leaves and the much broader bracts are going to help you identify it as a different species. And the other species that's very similar is another one that's fairly recently described, and I mean like 2001, but that's Carex Crawleyana. I'm probably not saying that right. Anyway, so that's a species that's fairly considered rare in Arkansas. I think it's in like northeastern part of Arkansas, like Crowley's Ridge. Its leaves are not as broad, but it does have those big, broad bracts. So if you're in that area, keep an eye out for Carex Crawleyana, or however you say it. But yeah, this is a nice one if you're in those mesic forests, especially in sort of those deep ravines or hollows. And here's Carex blanda, just to show you how it looks different, but also similar, right? So those really pale Perigenia, especially when it's not quite mature yet, they're going to be really super pale. Carex blanda, eastern woodland sedge, that name is a little misleading. I've seen it in just as often in open areas as I do in woods. And it really doesn't need like too wet of a soil. It can be fairly dry. Some differences between that and the last one we saw, Carex albercina or white bear sedge, is that the leaves are not nearly as broad. And the scales have a little pointy on. I don't know if it's easy to see on this or not, but yeah. Scales can be important just as much as the shape of the Perigenia for a lot of these species. And that is pretty much, I don't have any other species. I think we're over time anyway.
That is totally fine. This was awesome, Karen. I really appreciate it. Yeah, you
Okay.
covered quite a bit. So does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute your mic or put your question in the chat. And yeah, to those that I sent the wrong link out to, I really apologize for that. And if you missed the first part of this, then you can catch the recording on YouTube. I'll upload that here in a little bit. While we're waiting, in case anyone has any questions, I'll just go ahead and read just some of the comments people had. Jim Sullivan said, "Very well done. Your enthusiasm shines through." Sarah Gertz says, "Fantastic presentation and information. Thank you." Rob King, "Great presentation." Ingrid agrees. "Yes, wonderful info for plant nerds." I'd agree. Chelsea says, "Thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge." Laurie Scott, "Thank you so much information and a great presentation." Shayna says, "Thank you so much. I loved this." And then I believe you had one up top I'll read. Karen Sill says, "Thank you for the excellent figurative and physical images. All were very illustrative. Thank you for not forgetting what it is like to be a beginner and making your information accessible to those of us who are just now learning some basics." I would agree. I think you did a really great job starting at the bottom and building up from there.
Good deal.
Joe Ellen says, that was an amazing presentation, more than I ever thought I would know about sedges. Okay, any questions from the audience? We had 21 people. Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My question was, are there any sedges that are species of concern here in Arkansas?
Yes, there are actually a lot. So I've done a lot of work for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission looking for rare plants, and the majority, well, not the majority, but there's many species that are sedges. And so that's part of why I know so many, is because there's a lot of rare ones. So I don't know off the top of my head how many, but I want to say more than 10, 15 species are considered rare to the state of Arkansas. And some of them are very restricted in their habitats so that they're only in a handful of states. One that's really cool is, and I didn't mention it, I should have on my talk, was Carex arkansana. I don't know why I didn't even mention it. Arkansas sedge. But that one is considered endangered or of conservation concern, and there are quite a few species that are, and I think a lot of the reason that they are is because wetlands, because they live in wetlands and they're very habitat specific, maybe wet meadows, species whose habitats have been drained, converted for agricultural use, right? Like tall grass prairies, wet meadows. And so they're just, habitats are scarce, and so they're considered fairly rare.
Yeah, I think there's some statistic out there that says something along the lines of we've lost close to 70% of the wetlands in the eastern United States over the last couple hundred years, just due to, like you mentioned, draining for agriculture. I mean, those wetland soils are just so filled with organic matter and nutrient rich that, especially the ones in the Mississippi Delta and the Ohio River, have been drained over the years. And so I guess question I have, and you may or may not be able to speak anything on this, or there might just be a simple explanation, but I know that some like 88% of all Carex species are wetland species. Any particular reason for that? Did they just kind of evolve from a common ancestor that preferred those habitats, or can you say anything about that?
Well, that's not really the evolutionary, plant evolution is not really my area of expertise. So it's best for me to not say or speculate on that. But I would imagine that it's probably something to do with, yes, coming from an ancestor whose habitat maybe was that of a wetland. But I shouldn't say, because that's not my area.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the graminoids as a whole, the grasses have a good mix of upland and wetland, species. But when you get to the rushes and the sedges, it's so heavy on the wetland species, and just always wondered about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Okay. Well, thanks, Karen. We really appreciate you sharing your time and knowledge with us. I also want to thank everyone again for being with us here today. Again, the recording of this webinar will be uploaded to the Arkansas Native Plant Society YouTube channel, so please check that out within the next day or two. Our next webinar will be Saturday, August 19th from 10 a.m. to noon. Theo Witzel is going to give us a special 2-hour webinar on the plant inventory in Benton and Washington counties here in Northwest Arkansas, where so much development has taken place over the last couple of decades, or last 3 decades, really. And they've conducted a plant inventory, and he's going to share with us the results of that. So again, you can find out more about the Arkansas Native Plant Society on our website, anps.org. Check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/Arkansas Native Plant Society, or you can join at anps.org/join. All right. Well, thank you, Karen. We really appreciate you sharing this with us, and glad to have you back. And thanks for all you're doing for the flora of Arkansas.
Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.
Yep. Everyone have a good Saturday.